Ready? I will call to order the October 6th Planning Commission meeting. We'll start with our Pledge of Allegiance. Commissioner Klostermeyer, we haven't heard from you. Why don't you lead us? Staff, roll call, please.
All commissioners are present this evening with the exception of Commissioner Elmore, who is excused this evening.
Thank you. Moving into public comments, this is the time that we will take comments from the public on items not on the agenda this evening. Is there anyone that would like to speak? Seeing none, we'll move on to requests for continuances. Do we have any requests this evening?
There are none.
Thank you. Moving to our consent items, we have item number 1, the minutes of our September 8th meeting. Would anyone from the audience like to comment on this item this evening? Seeing none, I'll call for a motion.
I'll make a motion and add Mr. Mosier's edits to it.
We have a second.
I'll second.
Call for the vote.
The motion carries 5-0 with Commissioner Klostermeyer abstaining.
Thank you. Moving into item number 7, our study session. Code update related to fractional ownership. Staff, you want to?
Certainly.
Give us your
Thank you,
presentation.
Chair Clement and Commissioner Simone Georges, your Community Development Director. First of all, thank you for everyone showing up this evening. Tonight's a special meeting. We actually originally canceled it, but our City Council has given us some direction and some homework to work on. So again, thank you for attending the special meeting tonight. So tonight's item is the fractional ownership item, and I'm going to turn it over to Jaime Murillo, Principal Planner, here shortly. One thing to remember that this is just a study session. There is no formal action tonight, but we are asking the commissioners to provide your input, your feedback on some policy recommendations and policy thoughts that you may have on fractional ownership. We have a very robust presentation for you tonight. We've printed it for you and for the public. We encourage you to ask questions. If you need more time, if you need to give us homework assignments, that's perfectly fine and fair. Ultimately, our goal is to get a consensus with the commission, and so we can draft an actual ordinance that you can support and make a recommendation to the City Council at a future date. So I do encourage you to ask as many questions as you can on this topic this evening. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Murillo.
Thank you, Simone. Good evening, Chair Kleiman, members of the Commission. There we go. So as Simone mentioned, the purpose of this study session today is to provide the Planning Commission an overview and history of the fractional ownership issue, the pros and cons that we're hearing regarding this new type of land use, what the city's current regulations are, background regarding City Council and the direction they have given us. Want to share some of the research findings from our report that we had prepared, and then ultimately share some options and receive direction from the Planning Commission. So I just want to start off with what is fractional home ownership. And so this is a concept, it's not a new concept. It's been around for a while. It's typically been associated with more luxury items such as private jets or yachts, where multiple owners can come together to purchase more of these more expensive type items. But it's also common in real estate as well. It's fairly common with commercial real estate, but also with residential real estate. And it's common for a number of friends or family members to come together and buy a property to be able to afford real estate. But it is emerging more and more now through changes in technology, through fractional ownerships being offered online, for sale. And homeowners are a little bit more comfortable now entering into these arrangements with other parties that they're unfamiliar with due to this new kind of software and management application. And so there's a number of these new companies that are emerging. Here's a few of the companies that we're aware of, such as Picasso, Ember, and Nelson Family Estates, which are, these three are operators within the city. And then Chertini and Equity Estates are other companies that we're familiar with. But in terms of how this works, property is typically purchased and held under an LLC, and then shares of these properties are sold at various shares. So it's typical for a 1/8 share or greater. Some companies offer the smallest share is 1/6. In some cases, you can buy multiple shares. And then there's an operating agreement that's used to manage the property between the different owners. The co-owners agree on a usage plan. And so a 1/8 share typically equals 45 days. But these companies, to ensure that these owners can have equitable time in securing usage of the home, they restrict the usage. So typically it's less than 30 consecutive days. A 1/8 share, typically, and for Picasso's ownership, they limit no more than a 2-week consecutive stay. But these stays are all managed through an online calendar or some other program. Because these are all owned, each owner is responsible for paying their fair share of property costs. And this includes maintenance costs, property management costs, any HOA or cleaning, property taxes, utilities. All the various homeownership costs are shared equally amongst those owners. It's typical for these companies to prohibit, and these operating agreements to prohibit, subletting or short-term lodging. And at the end of the day, since these are owned by these property owners, they can sell their interests. Now I just want to go into pros and cons. And so a lot of the complaints we're hearing from residents that live nearby these fractional home ownership units is that these really operate more like short-term rentals. Even though they are property owners, when these owners come and visit their properties, they're exhibiting more vacation type behaviors that non-residents provide. So they're on vacation, they do invite people, they have parties. Some of those secondary effects, such as parking or trash, they're not putting their trash away, those are exhibited. And so those are those similar short-term lodging impacts that we're seeing and we're hearing about. There's also concern about commercialization of the residential neighborhoods, and that these are more like accommodations. And then there is impacts to housing affordability as people purchase more and more vacation homes. That limits the available housing stock within the community, and as a result, that results in increased home prices. In terms of claim benefits, I don't want to spend too much time on this because Picasso does have a presentation that they would like to share as well. But as far as quickly the benefits is there's less vacancy in these secondary homes. So Newport Beach does have a lot of second homes that remain vacant through most of the year. By having more owners turning through these units, the property is better maintained, and the claim is there's more spending in the community. There's multiple owners visiting the property, going to restaurants, shopping, and so there's a little bit more money being spent in the community. And then there's an argument that this also helps alleviate the pressure of median priced homes, because someone who would buy a more affordable home as a secondary home or vacation home, they're now more willing to buy a more luxury type home since it's more affordable in this 1/8 share type program. And I want to talk about how the city regulates, or how we've been looking at these fractional home ownerships. So the city can regulate land use. That's our zoning authority. However, we do not have the authority to regulate ownership. And then we can only enforce the regulations that we have adopted today. And so one of the difficulties the city is having is that holding a property in co-ownership or an LLC is very common. Over 56% of the single family properties in the city are held in some sort of LLC or trust. And so it's common to hold property in multiple ownerships. So in reviewing our code, in terms of holding property in co-ownership, like a single family dwelling, again, we can't regulate the ownership perspective. So This would be allowed as regular single-family use. As I mentioned, there is similarities to short-term lodging. Now, typically, short-term lodging is regulated and only allowed through a short-term lodging permit and prohibited in most single-family zoning districts. But again, fractional homeownership doesn't meet that definition of short-term lodging because short-term lodging is focused on the renting or leasing of a dwelling unit for a period of less than 30 days. Again, these properties are actually owned by these homeowners. And then the third definition to look at is a timeshare project. Timeshare projects are prohibited in residential zones and only allowed in commercial mixed-use zones. And although there's similarities to kind of timeshare, when we reviewed our ordinance, we don't believe fractional ownership meets the definition of a timeshare project. There's a lot on this slide, but the key items to focus on is what's highlighted. And so we have a number of definitions dealing with timeshare intervals, timeshare units, timeshare use. They all point back to the main definition at the top, which is timeshare project. Timeshare projects cover a wide variety of fractional ownership type uses, or I guess, I don't know, fraction of use. But that key term is development. And so in order to fall under that definition of a timeshare project, it has to be a development. And when we focus on the definition of development, this breaks down into like an actual construction project or major development project. But it doesn't address ownership again, and multiple owners is not considered development in reviewing our definitions. Also, just point out our timeshare requirements are focused on accommodations, and they're intended to ensure that timeshare projects include substantial amenities, an operating agreement, and it does go through a review process. But again, this is focused on accommodations and not the ownership of a residential dwelling unit. Now I just want to provide a little bit of background as to the discussions we've had with the City Council and the direction we've received. So last year, November 16th, 2021, after receiving a number of complaints, we did hold a study session with the City Council. At that time, we only had 4 known fractional ownership units in the city. The council directed staff to study what other cities are doing and how they're addressing this issue and report back. And so we worked with our consultant, Sagecrest Planning Environmental, and they provided a detailed report, which was attached to your study session report. And we presented the findings to the City Council on September 13th. When we presented the findings, there was 11 known homes in the city, and they directed staff to return with some proposed actions. So they essentially wanted to regulate fractional ownership uses. And so on September 27th, we returned to the City Council, and they initiated a zoning code and local coastal program amendment. They opted not to pursue a moratorium, but to ensure that we quickly address this, they directed staff to work quickly with the Planning Commission to develop code regulations to better regulate fractional ownership uses, develop standards so that they would be more in line with the character of residential neighborhoods. Briefly, just want to talk about or share some of the findings from the report that Stagecrest provided. They surveyed over 22 cities. 13 of the cities that they surveyed do consider fractional ownership as a form of timeshare. 7 cities do not regulate it. Either they weren't aware of it or they opted not to address the issue. 4 cities have revised their definition of timeshare to strengthen the regulations and to better be able to regulate these uses. 4 of the cities that do consider them timeshares have issued cease and desist letters. 3 cities are actively working on code updates now to regulate them more as timeshares, with the exception of Park City, which I'll get into in some later slides. Beverly Hills did adopt a moratorium, and then St. Helena is in active litigation with Picasso at this time. This is a map of the 12 known properties in the city. The ones in red are the properties identified in the Sagecrest report. The 2 identified in blue, Those are two newer facilities that we've identified since that report was completed. Something just to point out is the location of these units in the geographical area. You'll see that they're predominantly on the peninsula, Balboa Island, and Corona Mar. And when comparing that with the short-term lodging units in the city, they're generally in the same location geographically. So they are similar in location as far as where people want to be for vacation. Just want to highlight 3 cities. So St. Helena, as I mentioned, they're kind of the forefront in regulating this use, in that they are classifying them as as timeshares. But they did update their code to mirror kind of state law and broaden their definition. And the key component of their definition is really related to the right of occupancy for less than a full year. They limit timeshares to commercial zones and prohibit them in residential zones. They've also increased their enforcement authority and really modeled their ordinance after their short-term lodging ordinance as well. In terms of litigation, as I mentioned, they're in active litigation. On the slide, you can see the plaintiff's claims. So I think a lot of cities are watching what's happening at St. Helena. Palm Springs is another city that I just want to highlight. They do classify them as timeshares as well, and only allow them in zones where hotels are allowed. They do require the approval of a use permit, and they've also issued cease and desist orders. Park City is a little different. They're updating their code, and they actually have a hearing today. They've created a new definition of single-family dwelling fractional ownership. And so this is treated more as a residential type use, and they are allowing it in a wider variety of zones. Their focus is more on how they distinguish it from a normal LLC where you have multiple owners, is the ability of an owner to occupy the unit for less than 30 days at a time, or if there's unrelated co-owners, if there's a management or subscription fee, or like a reservation service. So if the ownership component has those types of components, then it'll fall under this new definition they're creating. This is just a map showing they're allowing it in a wider variety of areas, mostly in commercial zoning districts, and medium density residential districts are also where timeshares or residential clubs are allowed. But they are prohibiting them in historic, single family, and the estate zoning districts. They are going to require the approval of a use permit and the submission of a management plan. And this would ensure that there's responsible contact in case there's problems that can address any issues, and just ensuring that those owners are aware of snow removal or any property maintenance, trash regulations, and parking rules, just to minimize those kind of secondary effects. And they are also requiring a business license. And so finally, what we want to share is some ideas based on the recommendations we've received from City Council, and then hoping to receive direction from the Planning Commission. So the first issue is really with the definition, and we think there's really 2 options here. The first option is really following that St. Helena or other approach that some of the cities are doing to better classify them as a timeshare project or development. I think for Newport Beach, we would need to eliminate that term development, or update our existing regulations such that that development provision isn't a limiting factor. But we think would be important to, again, distinguish this from the typical co-ownership where friends or families come together to buy a property, is to clarify that fractional use includes some sort of plan that's facilitated, offered, or organized by a third-party manager. This is the approach Hermosa Beach is taking, or an approach that Palm Desert is taking, and includes something that would exclude arrangements whereby multiple parties join in directly purchasing full ownership of a unit, and then thereafter agree upon arrangements for its use. So it's not being arranged by a third party, but rather by the owners themselves. And so going through this approach, this is really would be considering fractional owners or this type of use more as an accommodation, which would effectively prohibit them in residential zones based on our current kind of land use matrix. The second approach we can take, this is one staff would actually recommend, is to create a brand new use to capture these. We would recommend fractional ownership land use. This would give us the ability to better regulate and allow these throughout multiple residential zoning districts, but allow us to better regulate them and include standards similar to short-term lodging. And then the focus would be on any use that limits the owner's rights to less than 30 days. Something else to consider is what's going to be the review process. And so there's a number of options. As some cities have done, they're requiring the processing of a use permit. If we go that approach, it's going to require a full public hearing. Or we can go the approach of a zoning clearance, which some other cities are taking. This wouldn't require a hearing and would allow staff to review and approval and just making sure that it meets all objective operating and development standards. In terms of parking, if we're going to create standards, staff would recommend that these properties provide parking in full conformance with current standards, and that includes both size of parking spaces and number of spaces. So for example, a single family home may require 2 or 3 spaces. We want to make sure those are being provided and that those parking spaces are maintained free of any obstructions and always available for use. We'd also recommend that we include some noise regulations or restrictions similar to short-term lodging restrictions that we have, and that they prohibit the use of any amplified sound outside or audible at any adjacent property lines from 10 p.m. to 10 a.m. to minimize those late night disturbances, and also just reinforce that they have to fully comply with the city's regular daytime noise ordinances. Separation standards are possible. If we allow them in the R1 zones, we believe we can apply a separation standard of, a recommendation would be 500 feet from other fractional ownership uses. We believe we can do that because short-term lodgings are generally prohibited in the single-family zones, and so that would give us the ability to do so. But in other residential zones, it would not be recommended to include a separation standard, in that we don't have a separation standard in our regular short-term lodging regulations. We'd also recommend that trash management be incorporated as a standard. Similar to short-term lodging, there would be concerns that they're not taking the trash out on the correct day or bringing the trash cans in because of the different times they're using the home. And so we would require that the property manager actually be responsible for taking out the trash and taking in the containers. We would also recommend that a management plan be prepared and submitted to the city. That way the city can review their operating agreement, ensure it includes all the compliance with the recommended standards, and that it includes a contact person that we can contact if there's any issues. We also recommend the prohibition of subletting, so not just for short-term rentals, but also for any other types of rentals. We'd recommend the posting a requirement that they post a good neighbor policy that includes clearly what all the owner's responsibilities would be, acknowledgement that they can be fined, what the contact person if there's any issues, just being very clear what the parking rules are for their neighborhood, what the street sweeping schedule is, trash collection rules, and the noise ordinances. We'd also recommend that each owner be required to sign an acknowledgement and submit that acknowledgement to the city to ensure that those owners understand what the rules are and they are responsible for complying with these rules. And then lastly, we would recommend some grandfathering provisions because it would be extremely difficult to retroactively regulate any existing uses that have been established, even those that are currently in the process. So we recommend that those that are kind of in the pipeline or already approved be allowed to remain as legal non-conforming uses. And that concludes my report.
Thank you. That was a very comprehensive report, a lot to digest. I know you had to undertake a lot of time to put that together, so I appreciate it. Any questions from commissioners for staff at this time?
Thank you. I had a question about option B and the concept of
that you'd mentioned, I didn't hear if that was going to take place. Would there be a permit that they would need to apply for, or application? And how would that work if you were going to, what does that look like?
I think, well, there's an option. It can be through a use permit or a zoning clearance. I think our recommendation is a zoning clearance. So once we have clear standards in place, they would submit a zoning clearance application to the city, and we would review that and then issue an approval letter. If they comply, if they don't comply, we would issue a letter indicating why they don't comply.
So we are looking at these fractionals as just a new land use category, where short-term lodging is not. It's really a permit program. So we're not looking as a permit program for fractional. We're looking as just a land use category when you go through your zoning matrix. Okay.
Commissioner Lowry?
Yeah, just a question. I should look this up before I came, but so fractional ownership and tenant in common, is it roughly the same? Are they defined the same? Because it says here fractional ownership, 1/8 ownership or greater, but I've seen some ticks with like 50 owners on the deed. So is fractional ownership, is it defined a little bit different where you can only have 8 or less? Or would it be more in line with, like I've seen tenant in common deeds when you could have a lot more than 8?
Yeah, so a lot of the way these are really set up is they form an LLC and they sell shares in the LLC. So it could be 1/8 or a quarter, and you're basically purchasing those shares. So it's a little bit different than kind of holding property as tenants in common, because the LLC is the actual owner of it,
Yeah,
and then
okay.
they own shares in the LLC.
And there's a limit at 8 or less. Is this one, the one bullet point? It says shares of the property are sold 1/8 ownership or greater. So
That seems to be the model that they've
Okay.
been using.
I'm saying they couldn't come in and have like 50 or something along those lines. That would be, very hard to manage, yes, but
And they also start to run in kind of the state regulations.
okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions? Commissioner Weigand?
It seems like a lot of these are in the coastal zone. Is there a way we can contain them to the coastal zone? And have we talked to Coastal Commission on what we're doing here, or what the discussion is related to? I mean, we had to go to coastal for short-term lodging. Is that kind of different area here, or are we going to have to go to coastal for these things? Because that's, most of them are showing up on that.
Well, certainly, we would have to go to the Coastal Commission for any kind of amendment to our local coastal program to regulate this. Our recommended approach is to identify this as a new land use category. So that would be new definitions and whatever standards would be in both Title 20 and in Title 21. And yes, we'd have to go seek an amendment with the Coastal Commission.
Could we restrict these only to coastal areas in our city?
So I think that in general, that's probably where they want to be located anyways. Some cities have taken a position where they basically have banned it by different types of zones. So, for instance, they may have banned it in single family, or they may have banned it in other places. I think that you probably get some pushback maybe from the council if you're trying to restrict it to the coastal zones and put it all in one area, because I think that some of the council members already feel that those areas are already overburdened. But I think that that's kind of where they want to be anyways, and we probably could craft something where we did restrict it to those areas if that's your preference.
And so you could restrict from and not allow them in R1 zones?
I think since we currently ban them in the R1 zone, that is an option. We basically put forward, kind of a distancing requirement in the R1 zone, because it is a little bit of a different use than short-term lodging. They do have an ownership interest. They only have 8 people typically that are owners of it. So it is a different use than short-term lodging. They have a stake in that property. But because the impacts are similar to what short-term lodging is, at least that's what the community's perception is and what evidence we've seen, then you could basically do the same thing that you're doing with short-term lodging, and you could ban them from the R1. We proposed 500-foot separation, though.
And has Coastal weighed in at all on any of this ever?
We have had some conversations with coastal staff, and they tend to look at this. They don't look at the fractional ownership of properties as an issue at all. It's not development, meaning multiple people can own properties, whether it's an LLC or tenants in common or some other form. So that's not the issue. It's how the property is used. And preliminary indications, the conversations I've had, they seem to look at these as timeshares.
And when it comes to the internal trading within of their fractional ownership, how are we going to enforce? Because we always talk about enforcement, and there's a lot of issues throughout the city that are coming up these days about enforcement. We want to enforce this and we want to enforce that. And how is the city prepared to enforce any type of violation, any type of internal, let's say, trading of these properties or these ownerships? So like if I was a 1/8 owner and I wanted to hand it over to my family or maybe my friends and say, well, that's part of my 1/8. I can, do whatever I please with that 1/8. How are we going to enforce if that's a prohibited action? How are we going to enforce it?
So the transfer is the transfer of ownership. So we don't regulate ownership. So if you want to transfer it to or sell it, your ownership to somebody else, we won't regulate that. We only regulate the land use aspect of it. And the land use is what we talked about, what Jaime put up on the screen with regards to property maintenance, parking, and we will enforce those as we do with all other municipal code violations. It's a reactive program. We have a code enforcement staff. They get the report and they do the investigation. But from a transfer standpoint, we don't regulate that. That's an ownership issue.
So
I do
when
think it
we-
is difficult, though. If somebody comes in and uses it that's not the owner, they let their friends use it or something like that, even though they're not supposed to. That can be a difficult issue to enforce on because you got to prove up who's actually using the property. So I can understand the challenges there.
And how does that work? I mean, if you've got 1/8 split up, surely there's some things you keep on the premises long term, right? Like bicycles or, bigger items. You can't just simply move into those every time you come back and forth. So, how do we regulate, say, like a garage is being used instead of cars? It's being used to store,
Right.
a bunch of, towels and, goods that you would, come in and out of. How are we going to do that? It just seems like you're adding, you have enough to do in
Right.
your department. How are we going to add more
Well,
enforcement?
it's like everything else that we handle. So we've already had a complaint on one fractional ownership that was initiated by Picasso, and what it was is they had actually cabinets in the garage that were used for storage, and each cabinet was assigned to an owner. So those cabinets actually took up parking space in the garage. Well, it's already a violation of our municipal code. We had a complaint, we responded, and we're working with the management company, the LLC, to remove those cabinets so we could open up that garage space. So like all issues and all violations, it's a reactive program. People have to tell us there's an issue, and that's how we address each of those code violations.
When it comes to the 1/8, is there a greater model or a lesser model? And can we regulate that model from a 1/8 fraction to a 1/6 or 4th or half, or can we go higher than 1/8?
So I think if you go higher, you suffer there is the Timeshare Act, and I forgot what it is. I think it's 1/11th. 11th. So you wouldn't want to go higher.
No,
Can you-
I'm not suggesting,
Sure.
but
But you
are
can
we,
go.
we
you can,
can we lower the threshold? Can we force the industry to have a 1/6 model?
Yes, you can. It
What's
is
the lowest you could get?
whatever the commission as a consensus wants to recommend. Yeah, but ultimately it is an ownership issue.
So obviously we need to have some type of negotiation between the industry and the city and say maybe a resident representative or, somebody on the outside that kind of can objectively look at this. How does those negotiations work when it comes to that? Because obviously the St. Helena case, I think, is under litigation right now as far as the time
Correct.
share component of it. So if we go and say, hey, we want to restrict in the city timeshare, and we revise the timeshare ordinance that we have on books, we're going to get sued, I would imagine, by the same way that St. Helena's being sued. Do I kind of have that sort of in the concept there? I mean, when do you think that's going to play out to give us an answer as far as if St. Helena is successful of challenging this timeshare aspect of Picasso versus And if that failed, then we know we can't go that route.
Right.
But we don't want to jump into doing that and then risk litigation on our city by, doing the exact same thing St. Helena's doing it. When do we think that's going to be resolved where we can at least have an answer?
So, to your first point about negotiating with the industry, we know there's at least 3 that are active in Newport Beach that Jaime's kind of gone through. So we could, from a staff standpoint, if that's the preference of the commission, we could definitely reach out to those 3 businesses and have conversations with them as far as what are they willing to accept from a regulatory standpoint. Our understanding is that they're willing to accept some regulations. To what extent, I don't know yet. With regards to the St. Helena lawsuit, it's definitely wise for us to monitor and see where that's going to end. And I think, are they going to trial, Aaron, in January? They propose to go to trial in January. And so we'll have to wait and see if that item gets continued or if they actually go to trial in January.
How long do those usually take once it goes to trial?
I would imagine it takes several weeks for them to get through it, probably under a month, but they're scheduled for the trial in January. But I think it'd be wise to, kind of see how that shakes out, because one of the proposals that was presented this evening, is basically modeled after kind of the same way that St. Helena is doing it, depending on what the preference of the council is, though. But it would be good to get some guidance, from that case.
But we probably could see first quarter of 2023 that we'd have somewhat of an answer. So it's not like it's a long wait, but it's, certainly 6 months out.
Sure.
And going back to kind of this negotiation that we would have with Picasso and how the city, comes up with all of these, ideas we have, they certainly kind of have to do that, right? Like we have to kind of feel what the industry would not push back on us on when we create an ordinance. Is that safe to say, or do you think we would be safe to put forward a proposal without risking any type of litigation?
No, I do agree with you that it's best that we have a kind of a transparent dialogue with the industry and see where they stand. I think we, from a staff standpoint, we've got to look at what the council direction was, and the council direction is to come up with some regulations. So if we can do that in a collaborative manner with the industry, I think that's a smart way to approach it.
Well, I agree with that, but do you think, and no offense to our city attorney, do you think there would be a wise option to bring in a third-party attorney who may have some expertise in this particular matter? Not, again, I'm not being critical of in-house counsel, but having somebody who is an expertise on fractional ownership that could guide us in a well-balanced manner that looks at it maybe from a objective standpoint.
So typically the way our office works, and I think there'd be a little bit of confusion on it. So we typically provide all the legal advice to the city and, work with staff on things. But when we have issues where we need to reach out for expertise, we do reach out and ask. We have lots of attorneys on retainer that are experts in different areas. And that could always be an option. This issue seems pretty straightforward so far. But if it looks like we are unable to reach a deal with the industry, and it looks like we may be headed to litigation, we'd probably bring in some land use litigation attorneys and get their thoughts on things before we move forward.
And then there's one other thing too. So Picasso helps purchase the property and then sell it to the fractions. Is that their only business model, or do they also manage the fractions once it's owned?
So Picasso purchases the property and then prepares it for the fractional sale to the 1/8 ownership, and then they maintain the property management side of things and collect a fee. My understanding, you could ask the Picasso representative later, is that if the majority of the LLC, of those 8 owners, majority want to fire Picasso and have their own management company, they have a right to do so. But I don't know what that relationship is or what their agreement says from a property management standpoint and a termination standpoint.
Do we think that that's a good thing or a bad thing for the city if they aren't managing it? Where does a fractional ownership household go if they fired Picasso?
So our recommendations this evening were to ensure that there is a management company, that there's an operating agreement, a management agreement, and a management company. So somebody has to manage these properties. And so that's part of the regulations that we've put forth for you this evening. So we do think that management is an important piece to this.
And we have a preferable list, or it just has to be whoever? It could be John Smith, random.
Yeah, we haven't
guy
got to
down the
that
street.
level, granular level.
And one other thought I had on this is, once purchased as a fractional property, what's what's the likelihood that that home ever comes back to just being a single family or a single owned property? You know, I worry about an over concentration. I appreciate adding the separation between, because, you know, we have similar things with short-term lodging. We have similar things with recovery residences, you know, sober living homes, you know, with an undue concentration in neighborhoods. And that really bothers a lot of our residents and causes a commercial aspect in our residential neighborhoods. So, you know, I feel once this is purchased into the 1/8 or 1/6 or whatever we decide on, or however this process goes, we're looking at a community that's forever changed. Once it's purchased into that, you're no longer having single family residences or single owned residences.
Right.
Now, I get that there was a study that said that there's a lot of LLCs and there's a lot of multi-owned families in Newport, and I don't want to restrict those. I want to prevent a grandparent situation where they hand that down to their family and their family hasn't decided what to do with that property. And I want to make sure that they're protected, because there are a lot of family homes in Newport Beach, a lot of handed down properties over the years. So we need to be cognizant of not hurting those folks, because I have a personal situation with exurbating that, you know, very close to home, where a family member has given that to other family members themselves. And they all come to Newport throughout the course of the year in a similar type of terms, but a little different. So we have to be very mindful and protective of that. I'm sorry that I'm going on with so many things here, but I do think that these are topics that we should be open for discussion.
Thank you.
Any other?
Kind of two parts. The first one, it might be best to ask the Picasso or other ownership group, but if 8 people buy a house under an LLC, and let's say Picasso is out at that point, could they not, that 8, now that they are just the members or the managers, could they not just alter the operating agreement? And now all of a sudden they're not bound, changed, you know what I mean? Some of these requirements, and now they're not bound by anything, and it's just the same as me and 6 buddies buying a house.
It's true. I think there's anything it's possible, right? But when we are characterizing, they need a zone. Our recommendation is to get a zone clearance. So that's a letter that we will issue and that we'll have in our file. So once a property is designated as a fractional ownership, you have all these rules you got to comply with. You're in violation of the rules. We'll handle the enforcement side of things.
When I was looking at the survey, it looks like a bunch of cities already define these, you know, as timeshares. So are they, I mean, some are in litigation. Many it sounded, you know, from reading in the summaries are not. Are their use standards just that broad that they haven't been sued yet? I know there's some don't even have them, or have some kind of found the middle ground that everyone can live with, and, you know, keeping enough people happy and, you know, also allowing the business to somewhat stay alive.
So I think different cities are definitely taking a different approach to it. A lot of the cities that have said, you already fall under our timeshare ordinance, have issued these cease and desist letters, and kind of gone down the enforcement path. But that allows Picasso to kind of, or the other entities, fractional ownership companies, to just basically sit back and wait for enforcement, and then they can cross-complain once they get into litigation. So I think it's just a strategy by the fractional ownership companies, is that if people want to take enforcement action against them, that's fine, and if they want to eventually initiate litigation, then they'll cross-complain and challenge the ordinance itself. So I think they'll eventually be in litigation to the extent they move forward and really try to enforce the law. But they're probably going to get cross complaints in that scenario. So rather than Picasso, kind of pushing forward and suing some cities, it seems like they've taken more of a role or more of a position that will wait for them to actually move forward with the enforcement and then cross complain probably.
Okay. And does it seem like, well, actually, one was, can you comment on, was it Carmel? It's been adjudicated, but there weren't any comments on it?
We'll have Mr. Murillo address Carmel. You remember?
It was an underlying issue that was adjudicated. It wasn't specifically fractional ownership, but it was Carmel by the Sea.
I'm just looking. I'm just sorry. I'm just looking at the report. So it's Carmel by the Sea has issued the cease and desist order, but when Sagecrest reached out to them, the city did note that, let's see, their regulations on transient commercial use of residential property was previously adjudicated. But I don't know. I don't know the details. So, sorry.
Okay.
Any other questions? Commissioner Klotzmeyer?
I'm just curious in the interim, before we come to some type of a way to regulate this, let's say that 6 months down the line, 12 months down the line, during that period of time, let's say there's another 40 homes that are sold. Is there any way to regulate the fractional ownership of homes that have been purchased before there's regulation that is put in place?
So ultimately, you could look at some type of amortization program, but typically they're going to have a very good defense that they're basically a non-conforming use. And typically, the way you deal with non-conforming uses is you go through some type of amortization program after the fact if you want to go back and regulate them.
Secretary Rosine?
Seems like a lot of this has to do with the definition. And we're going back and forth between some timeshare ordinance and this, maybe even short-term lodging, or going through this land use concept. And I'm just wondering, is there any benefit to some hybrid of that where you amend the language like you had mentioned regarding the word development, and then putting together something in the land use side to sort of plug that hole?
Yeah, I think staff what was recommending tonight was basically looking at defining this kind of as a new land use, looking at it as fractional ownership. This model is based on having people stay under 30 days, not letting people stay at the same time, and that leads to arguably the same impacts that you have with kind of short-term lodging. So looking at how other cities have been addressing this issue, I think that a more narrow approach is probably the better approach, and I think it's more defensible because you already have seen the impacts with short-term lodging. The model's basically very similar to what short-term lodging is as far as how long they're going to stay there. Now, like I said, it is different because they're owners, they have a financial stake in the property. You're only going to have 8 people coming through, so you're not going to have as many different people. But by creating a very short window of time that people can stay there, you sort of get that kind of turnover and a lot of the impacts that short-term lodging have. So I guess my preference would be to kind of go forward more with the fractional ownership type of model, something a little more narrow that addresses the issues, and then kind of build the regulations from there that are very similar to the short-term lodging. Maybe have it as a zoning clearance as opposed to a use permit. That may be one way to address this, and I think that's defensible. And I think the industry agreed to it, but I do like the idea of working with the industry and seeing what they find acceptable as well, and making if you can work out a deal with the industry, then you're definitely going to avoid litigation. And so I think it's definitely worth meeting with the industry to see what their thoughts are on the matter.
If there are no other questions at this time, I was going to just say, if it might be helpful for the commission, it looks like we have a representative from Picasso. I know there are a number of companies that are operating under similar models, but if we have someone here, would that be helpful to the commission? Do you have questions that you might want to hear? Yeah? Or do you want to ask your question first? Are you sure? Going once? Okay, so I'll go ahead and open it up. But this is not a public hearing, but we will take comments from the public. Did you want to come up and address the commission? And if any questions come up that you can answer, that'd be helpful.
We actually had a presentation queued up, which will address many of the things that are being discussed right now. Is that available? Okay. Perfect. All right. Well, good evening, commissioners. My name is Gabe Demas-Smith, Public Affairs Manager for Picasso. We greatly appreciate the opportunity to present to you today and answer questions in a hope to demystify a lot of the things that are being discussed about our business model. So I think something that is vitally important that was already articulated here, this co-ownership model is not something new in the city. It's actually an age-old practice that's been happening for decades here. You know, our data shows 41%, but we just saw a report that 51 or more percent of homes are housed in a property-specific LLC or trust. You know, we found in our research that many of these arrangements have 2, 3, 4, 5, ownership groups. And I think that's an interesting point to us because if this has been going on for decades, there hasn't been such a knee-jerk reaction to this occurring in the city, resulting in a need for, hastily or quick action towards, regulation. I think it's important to identify that Picasso takes 2 to 8 buyers and puts them in one home. Not in all cases is it 8 individuals, it could be 2. So that interval of rotation of use of the home may actually be significantly less than what people think. It's important to note that with our data, we found that, in a month timeline, you may just have 4 to 5 changes of hands in this home. No different than anyone else who were to own a second home in this community. Pretty common. So let's talk about our business model. What do we do? At our core, what is critical to us is basically facilitating the process to enrich people's lives through second home ownership. We do this by organizing a property-specific LLC in which we sell ownership within that LLC to, again, those 2 to 8 owners. And they have 100% control of the real estate. And we solely play the role of property owner. Again, there's a lot of conversation about defining what this business model is. Is it a timeshare? It isn't a timeshare. Again, it's a common practice of something that's been occurring in the city for multiple decades. And there is no predetermined limitation on the homeowner's ability to use the home. 1/8 ownership does not equate to 1/8 use. For example, if all of you owned a property together, you could use, let's say, a Google Calendar to organize when you're going to use the home, during what period. There's no difference here. We just provide a scheduling app, making it easier to create a more equitable way they can share their home. Again, no different than any second homeowner within the city. So who are our owners? Our owners are retirees. A lot of the owners within the structure actually have long-term roots in Newport Beach. They may have moved away for work. They want to use the property to spend time with family. These are grandparents who want to enjoy their grandchildren. A lot of them are retirees from law enforcement. So these are folks that are specifically coming to use the home for single family use only. They're not vacation renters. They're not partiers. They pay property taxes. They put 30% down to, own their home, and they clear credit and criminal background checks. So they're neighbors, again, neighbors, not short-term renters. Actually, short-term renting is holistically prohibited within the business model. There are no large events or parties. We adhere to quiet hours from 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. There is no commercial use of the property, and street parking is prohibited or strongly discouraged. And this is something vitally important, along the peninsula. There's not a lot of opportunity for parking in the street. We do our best to park on the property or within the garage. There was an example brought up earlier about a code enforcement complaint, and I think that's an example of the process here in Newport Beach works. We found out about the complaint. We're adjusting all the garages throughout the city to make sure it adheres to the 2-car, requirement of the city. So again, we are working diligently with the city and open to address anything when it arises. But I think what's the vital important of our business model is that we offer a fully managed experience. It's about when people come to enjoy their second home, we remove the burden of second home ownership. And what we're very proud of is we employ local vendors here, whether that's a cleaning company, landscaping company, interior design. So let's talk about Picasso versus other models, because I think this is the meat and potatoes here today. So Picasso is focused on single family use only. We're not a hotel, condo, operator. We're not renting out apartments. Again, it's holistically prohibited. In this model, it's true ownership. Individuals own the property, they use it like owners for that specific purpose. And the access is ongoing usage. They're here not just for a week, for 3 days, they're here for a substantial amount of time using the property and returning over and over throughout the year. Something we're incredibly proud of is the ability that, just like any home ownership, individuals can resell their share. We're proud as a company, we're able to pay out $21.5 million in commissions to local real estate agents because, again, this is a real transaction, no different than any type of ownership. And I think something that really sets us apart from the resort timeshares that we don't have a timeshare project. It isn't an interval sharing of time based on having 1/8 ownership. It is holistically and importantly, they use it as you would any single second home. So let's talk about, there's a lot of things to demystify here about Picasso versus, a traditional second home. In fact, there's value added here. When we're facing an affordable housing crisis, we're getting a lot of, requirements from Sacramento on RENA, housing requirements. Having homes that are better utilized, taking 8 buyers on the market who may in fact have bought 8 homes, utilize it for a short period of time. It's actually better moving that demand away and making sure that homes are better utilized. So for example, traditionally the second homes used about 11%, but through this model of co-ownership, we're seeing 90% utilization, which is paying dividends to the local economy. We're seeing about 10 times more spending in local businesses, where you're going to hear from a business owner today about the impact that's made when coming out of COVID and not having a lot of business. She's seen an uptake, having, more ownership in the community. And, I think the devil's in the details here. It's Picasso versus Airbnb. But before we go into the micro specifics here, I think it's important to talk about how Airbnb operates. So Airbnb provided a service where individuals could use an app or go on a website and put their home up to be rented, right? That means in one day you could have 500 homes within their database. When you look at a model like Picasso, we're focused on homes that are 4 or 5 times more than the local median price point here, meaning that it would require significant amounts of capital investment in the billions of dollars to even get a third of what the market share potential could be for a short-term rental. And that's just not our business plan. That's not what we're interested in doing. So this fear that we're going to jump from 12 homes to 40 is, very unlikely to happen. And in addition to Airbnb, which was largely unregulated and essentially the owners were the property manager, meaning that the behaviors are random, not predictive, and anything could occur at the party. Again, the model through Picasso is regulated. There's more enforcement. There's penalties for violating codes. I know one of the recommendations were, hey, making sure that the ownership group is aware of the city code to place that. We're currently doing that in the home. We have all your code enforcement and rules. We're making sure the ownership group adheres to that. And then more importantly, it's only limited to their friends and family, no different than a second home. You have ownership groups in the city that have 2 to 3 families in operation within an LLC, similar to that of a Picasso. So they're also letting their families and friends use the property, and there hasn't been, a huge public outcry. So again, with these regulations and having a property manager at place, you can see there's a reduction in the revolving door at these homes. So let's talk about facts versus fiction here. We're aware of the one code enforcement. We are already working diligently on addressing that. Again, I highlighted that's an example that the process works. But, the comments we're generally getting are not complaints about what the model is doing. We're hearing that Picasso owners are wonderful people. The home ownership group is responsive to the needs of the community. Picasso works swiftly with code enforcement to address any, critical issues going on in the community. But a lot of the negative responses, we are afraid that this model could get out of hand if another actor, which we are aware of that a bad actor can arise in this industry or a runoff bad owner. But that's why we are completely open to working with the city on, positive solutions that can address the concerns and protect this community, because our owners are here because they want to be a part of the fabric of this community. The way it is, they have no interest in coming in and changing the culture here. Moving forward, there were a lot of cities that were highlighted that are having, issues, their cease and desist letters. A lot of this is because we're actually in negotiation with most of these cities and moving towards a point of reconciliation in which litigation is not our first step. That's not where we're going. We understand there's community concerns, and we believe that rowing together provides an opportunity for us to address these concerns with the community. Again, something critically important, they talked about a piece about having someone that residents or members of the commission or council members can contact about a specific home. We mark it out, neighbors@picasso.com. We have a best practice here. We respond to questions and concerns within 24 hours. We send out staff to address any things that need to be, taken care of. And there is a process available to, reconcile any challenges. And again, we're open to expanding that process and working with the city. We don't believe this needs to be something that is a knee-jerk reaction. We know that as we're working with other cities who kind of are farther along in this process, there is a path to move forward to make this work in the best interest of everyone. And again, my name is Gabe Demas-Smith, Public Affairs Manager at Picasso. My information's up there, and I'm available for more specific questions if there are any.
Anyone have any questions?
What does this fine structure look like for violators and those who are, bad actors or bad owners? So what you talked about fines, and you talked about, your enforcement. Break us down how that looks, how that works, and do you partner with the city when it comes to it, or do you do it all? Is that self-contained? How can you apply any teeth or muscle to it if it's already purchased and owned by folks?
Commissioner, I think that's an excellent question. I think the first piece of this shows the opportunity here with having a co-ownership group working with a property management company that builds the structure that the ownership group adheres to. So in our model, we have what we call our code enforcement procedures within what we contain as our neighbor playbook, ensuring that our neighbors are moving forward with the best practices available. So how this works, right? There's a tiered process. There's an internal review. Complaints can be filed. We review them. From there, we can issue out fines depending on what occurs within the home. Again, this is something supported and managed by the operating group. This is something, now you talked about the piece with the city. This is something in a lot of our conversations with cities, we are negotiating how that can align with, the city code. But unfortunately, we started out it being just an internal mechanism that's proven to work. We don't have a lot of disruption. There's not a lot of data to show that we have excessive parties or our ownership groups across the nation create challenges for the community. So it works, but we are scaling that up by working with, communities just like the city of Newport Beach.
Like a fine. What kind of fine would you determine? What, like, is it a dollar amount, or is it more like a?
Yeah, so it's twofold. There's opportunity for monetary fines, but another part of our agreement is there's a right to suspend stays, which is agreed upon by the ownership group. So that also can help us kind of limit if there's a bad actor in the ownership group and create a process towards reconciliation.
And so if you've got a 1/8 split, how do you boot out one of the bad actors from that? What do you have to have a shareholder vote? How does that work?
Yeah, so are you talking about the process of eliminating someone from the ownership group? I think, respectfully, that's a question for legal. There's a process that goes through that. That's not a process we've had to undergo to date, but I'm definitely willing to come back and follow up with, a robust kind of walkthrough of how that process works.
Is Picasso a publicly traded company?
It is not.
And how does that work with your competitors? Can a city, and maybe this is for city staff, but can a city regulate a different competitor of yours? Can we say we only want Picasso? Can we say we don't want Picasso and we want their competitors? Do we have the ability to do that?
No. you basically would get an equal protection challenge. You get lawsuits out of that. You basically have to set up your rules and then have everybody operate under those. I do think that but through the enforcement side, you can get rid of bad actors, and you see it in the short-term lodging. We revoke permits, even in the group residential setting. We've revoked group residential uses in the past. Like Morningside Recovery, they had multiple facilities in town. They weren't really operating in conformance with the rules. We shut down multiple of their facilities. So I think there are ways to kind of address it. It does take time, but you need to set up one set of rules and then kind of move forward with that.
Can we as a city give the boot to one of the 8, or do we have to give it to the all?
So I think you would be taking, you'd be taking enforcement against the whole. You wouldn't be taking it against one of the independent operators. Actually, I think that's an interesting question. You might be able to take action against an independent operator, but you wouldn't be able to get them removed from the ownership. So if one of the property owners who owned an 8th was acting badly, you could take action against that individual property owner, but you couldn't remove them from the ownership. Only the company could do that. I did have a meeting with one of their representatives several months ago, and they did tell me that they had a provision in their agreement that did allow them to eliminate a bad actor, shareholder, and that's something that they would look at doing if they found themselves in that situation. Now, I haven't seen documentation to that effect, but that's what they did tell me.
You mentioned, not changing culture, but would you agree that if multiple homes in a neighborhood were purchased by Picasso, you would be changing the culture and changing the face of that neighborhood? If you had a 20, 30, 100, in the vicinity of, the peninsula. I mean, yeah, we could have these separation ordinances in place, but, 500 feet isn't that great when you start adding up throughout our neighborhoods. So, would you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. That's a great comment. My comment to begin with is it would change the culture of the community if it wasn't just, Picasso, let's say, or second homes that sit vacant. No one was there 90% of the year. Could change the community. This conception that we're going to be 40, 50, 100 homes, that's just, frankly, is never going to happen. Would that change the character of the community? Yes, but I don't think that's what's happening here. I know that's a fear, but that has not occurred at this stage. But through, I think, working with the city and finding a pathway towards regulation, I think we can find something that prevents a lot of the potential variables that may occur one day.
Yeah, because at this stage, we're kind of in the infancy of
correct
this idea. Mm-hmm. When we go back to, historical on Airbnb and, that, VRBO, correct, that was in its infancy at one point.
Correct.
And then we all had to then scramble to get something done to kind of save the character of our neighborhoods. So, I appreciate the opportunity here to try to figure that out. I don't know if that's something we can solve in the short period of time, either tonight or, our next meeting. But what is your thought on this, idea of coming to the table with, the city, but maybe, a third party, attorney to look at some land use, maybe discuss this with some resident, input, which we might hear tonight, maybe we'll hear out into the future. But you know what, I think there is concern, and I've heard the concern, and we want to make sure that we do this right. So I want to make sure staff's not rushing through this, and we're not rushing through this.
Sure.
And you're not rushing through this. So,
No.
But we want to, there is some pressure in the community to get something done as soon as possible. But there are some concerns I have when it comes to the families in our city that might have a similar model, but it's internal. It's, are we going to have title guys and real estate agents, monitoring this for us? How do we do that? How do we work with that industry? I'd love to bring the realtors, our local realtors, involved in this discussion too, because, as you mentioned, it does benefit real estate agents, and a lot of our agents live in our city. But we want to make sure that, and they want to make sure too, their residential neighborhoods are protected and safe. Right. So I think there's a lot of things going on here that are circling in my head. Thank you. It's hard to come up here and get grilled by us without knowing exactly what we'll grill you on.
And
so
we're more than happy to work with the city. If you don't mind, I'd like to respond. You had a question about Carmel. I'm prepared to answer that if you're
think
interested.
maybe another commissioner did, but
You did? Would
we
you?
look kind of similar. He's got more hair though.
You both have more hair than me. Sure. Let me respond to that. So, of course, as you know, there is a cease and desist letter, present. Was the knee-jerk approach to the city. At this stage, we are working diligently with the city towards a path towards reconciliation. That's why there is no litigation. There's nothing of the sort there. That's something we feel like will get sorted out in time. And that's the approach we want to take to cities, because I think we all can acknowledge that there's a big issue at play. This has an impact to thousands of potential residents across every jurisdiction we operate. And we want to do this the right way, but also a thoughtful way, because we care about the community. Our approach here is we want to enrich lives through second home ownership. We're not enriching lives, we're damaging the community in which we want to enrich. So, again, thank you for your time, and I'm more than happy to take any other questions.
Secretary?
Would you like to expand, since we're talking about regulation and you seem to be open to that concept, on what regulation you're willing to take on at a more granular level so that we can understand what we're talking about here? I've heard a lot of talking about regulation, but I didn't hear anything specific. So I'm looking for something specific from you.
Commissioner, tough to have like a robust discussion right now about what that would look like, because first we'd have to, fundamentally understand the perspective of the city and what they think is needed towards reconciliation. But what I can speak to is we are willing to do anything. A lot of the proposals that you had on like behaviors and enforcement are in the new Newport Municipal Code. If there are areas where that is not sufficient, we're open to talking about ways to, circumvent those challenges. That's a conversation we've already shared with staff. We're more than willing to send, some recommendations on policy that we've, from our engagement and feedback we've gotten from other cities that could be helpful in this conversation. But to respond with what the exact proposal look like, that's a little challenging for me to do. And I respect your attempt here. Good form.
Commissioner Harris?
For our city specifically, where is the manager located? Do you have people locally who kind of handle it? And then second, will you walk us through, let's just think of an incident. Somebody's, having a party, it's late, whatever, neighbors are upset, it's loud. Obviously they can call the police, but do you have someone they can get a hold of? I mean, I know you're speaking for the whole industry right now, but you specifically, do you guys have a number or somebody local that they can get a hold of, kind of nip it?
Yeah. Absolutely we do. Every property has a home manager who is local in the Newport community, so there is someone accessible. We try to do our best to express that information by doing a bit of door knocking and providing that information. If there's a way that you have a recommendation, we could do that more efficiently. We're open to do that. But yeah, it's incredibly important to have someone available 24 hours a day to address, public concern. And of course, make sure that our owners are happy and safe and enjoying their stay as well.
Any other questions? Commissioner?
Would a fractional home be held in perpetuity? I know that certain owners can sell their shares to other owners, but would there ever be a situation when, let's say there were 8 owners, Picasso wanted to sell the home just to an individual buyer, or it feels like it's difficult to exit this strategy once you've entered it.
Sure, I think that's an excellent question. So as I indicated in the presentation, we don't own we have no ownership once the shares are sold to the ownership group. So we wouldn't even have a right to say, hey, we want to sell this home back on the market fully. That's not an option in this structure.
So it would essentially need to be all of the homeowners agreeing to sell it to one buyer.
Correct. That would be no different than the other fractional ownerships that were present before the business existed.
Thank you.
Anyone else? How are these financed, and more importantly, what happens when one of the owners defaults?
That's a great question. So Picasso does offer up to 80% financing. The company is responsible for backing the loan, and we have a process to protect the interests of our owners. I don't want to fully go into that because that's a trade secret for us. But good question.
You talked about a code. That's something that you're updating that includes some of the things that we've talked about, these nuisance issues that are problematic for neighbors in any city that you're operating in.
Sure. Yeah, so we do have our court enforcement, our best neighbor practices, which is a policy document that we're more than willing to share with the commission. It includes, honestly, 90% of every recommended proposal that I heard about potential behaviors. And because we pride ourselves in being robust, our industry had the privilege of learning from the shortcomings of Airbnb and Vrbo by seeing what happened and then integrating mechanisms to prevent those challenges right out the gate. And we know that things diversify, there's potential changes, and we're more than willing to update and, make sure everything's functional.
So each owner commits to that? Is that something they sign off on as part of the ownership process?
100% correct. Each ownership group agrees that these rules are, they can't participate with us as a property management company. And we're hoping to work with the, council and the commission here to make that the industry standard.
And then do you typically post something on site for each of these properties that includes, delineating all of the code enforcement issues, quiet hours, trash requirements, noise, and other parking, things like that?
We absolutely do. It's actually something on the kitchen counter of every single property, explaining that each one is uniquely tailored to the specific jurisdiction we're in. So we do the due diligence. I do the due diligence to make sure we've reviewed all the city codes and make sure things are being appropriately applied. I know there's a recommendation to post it outside of the home. That's something we're definitely open to.
Last question. Can you talk about how the property taxes are paid?
Okay. Yeah, sure. So I think that was in the staff report. The property taxes are passed through all the owners. They pay property tax just like any other owner in the city. If the question is, I think, alluding to TOT tax, we do not pay TOT tax because it is not a transient use. It is a ownership group, no different than any other ownership group in the city, which means, those multiple ownership groups, upwards to 51%, potentially all would be paying TOT tax.
Thank you. Any other questions from the commission? Thank you so much for being here, for your time.
Thank you.
We'll go ahead and take additional public comments at this time.
Hi, my name is Carmen Rosen, and I sent information to you. I'm sure you didn't have time to look at it. That I submitted for the September 13th City Council meeting, September 27 meeting, and also for now. First, I would like to ask the staff, and maybe they would reply or no, where is that development definition that they show in the presentation? Because if I go to the Newport Beach Municipal Code, under the definitions, let me find it here. I get a different definition, not that. So where did that definition come from about development? If I go to the chapter 2170, it says development means on land, in or underwater, the placement or erection of solid material or a structure, etc., etc., etc. It doesn't talk about dividing the lot into two and so forth, what they presented that. To me, and also the timeshare definition that is in the municipal code, the timeshare project, it doesn't say new development. To me, if you do have a building, a single family home on a plot of land, that is a development. That was done before. So I would like that clarification. Then we keep talking about fractional ownership, and to address Mr. Eric concerns about families. For example, I used to own a property with my husband in Poinsettia, Corona del Mar, under an LLC. We had 2 members, my husband and I. I didn't tell my husband, you get to use the property only 180 days of the year, and I get the other 180 days. And that's the difference between a fractional ownership on an LLC or a trust that is family members, or where you do it maybe to limit your liability. If you own several properties and somebody sues you, maybe you want them to come after you in that property only. There are many other reasons that you do it. But Picasso is a timeshare because they do limit the number of days each owner is at the property. You cannot have the 8 fractional owners be at the property at the same time. It's 44 nights. Also, they tell them 6 stays each owner, a maximum of 14 days, a minimum of 2 days per stay. So they have a lot of regulations. So if each owner has 6 stays, that's 48 move-ins and move-outs. So it's like a short-term lodging operationally, but you do not have the same teeth to go after them in enforcement. When you have a short-term lodging permit, if you have violations, you get $1,000 fine, then $2,000 fine, then $3,000 fine. After so many violations, they suspend your permit for 6 months, or they revoke the permit. Once a property owner has purchased his fraction of the property, you cannot take away the ownership of the property. Now they say, oh, these are owners, so they have a better investment in the community. Think about Dennis Rodman. He was an owner too, and how many headaches he gave in the city with his parties and all that. So to me, saying an owner, property owner, will have better care, better about the community versus a vacationer is not true. These are, yes, vacationers that decided, hey, we like this city, we come here every year, so let's do an investment. So instead of going through Airbnb or whatever, we are going to get our weeks with our family, but they are not part of the community. What we need to do is have more long-term residents. I live in the Balboa Peninsula. We are already oversaturated with the short-term lodging. We have a maximum of 1,550 permits, but we are already above that. So now we are going to have all these other properties. It's not different.
Chair
And you
Fleming?
have less.
So our timer is stopped working, unfortunately. So the buzzer did go off, but it's not ringing.
Oh.
So we're going to go
Well,
manual.
Picasso was given plenty of time. I would like to be given time too, please.
It sounds like we were over the 3 minutes. We just don't have a functioning timer. Is that? Could you just finish your thoughts so we can get to the next speaker, please?
Yes, I guess I would like, please follow option A, not option B, because you won't be able to control it. And if you're going to follow option B and you have the 500 feet separation, a good part of the Balboa Peninsula is R2 zone, not R1. So please apply that also for R2, not yes R1.
Thank you. Mr. Mosier?
Chair Kleiman, members of the Planning Commission, my name is Jim Mosier. I need to begin by saying I was very surprised to see the extensive presentation from staff about their option B, as if the direction from the City Council had been for you to find a way to legalize these fractional ownerships with some kind of regulation, kind of like a new form of short-term lodging in Newport Beach. I'm looking at the draft minutes from the September 27th City Council meeting that were posted at 4 o'clock this afternoon. I don't see that as being the direction that the City Council gave the staff or asked you to do. What I heard at that meeting was there seemed to be universal agreement that timeshares are not currently allowed anywhere in Newport Beach except in certain commercial areas. The staff had told the council that these particular kind of home ownership didn't fit the definition of timeshare, and I believe the direction was for you to come back with a definition that would fit this model and perhaps exclude those few that Commissioner Wygant is talking about. I don't actually think that revision is necessary, as the community of St. Helena also found was not necessary, because I believe this definition, and Carmen's confusion as she is looking at the definition in Title 21, our local coastal plan implementation, this is the definition from Title 20, our zoning code. This definition has been in our zoning code since 1982. And there was no doubt at that time that this definition prohibited any kind of timeshare in residential areas, in fact, anywhere in the city of Newport Beach, including the Picasso model. So we've been told that the city cannot regulate ownership, it can only regulate land use. This has been regulating a land use, not ownership, since 1982. The land use, as Carmen was trying to explain, is where one party has an exclusive right to use a dwelling unit for a limited time during a year on a recurring basis, same as the definition, similar to the definition in St. Helena. So that the thing that is being regulated is land use, not the ownership. Never has been. And the word development that appeared here, I believe, Carmen is correct. It just meant a building, any kind of development that we have in the city was prohibited from that. Over the years, and I'm afraid we don't have the timer, it makes this very awkward. In 1996, the city council decided to allow certain kinds of timeshares in commercial areas.
Time's up.
Go ahead and finish your thought, Mr. Mosier.
Yes. The city attorney told the city council on September 27th that that was a change, a switching around of what the definition of timeshare was, which is not a sensible interpretation of that. Because if the intention was to allow uses in commercial areas, the city council at that time did nothing, no indication that they wanted to change the existing prohibition of other uses. They were allowing them in commercial areas. They were not changing the prohibition. So anyway, I believe these have been prohibited since 1982. There's never been any intention to change that. It's in writing here if the time is up. So thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good evening, commissioners. My name is Max. I am a local Picasso employee, and instead of giving my comment, I'm going to give a comment of one of our Picasso owners, Kathy and Randy. My name is Kathy, and my husband is Randy, and we are co-owners on Balboa Island. I'm a former partner at Deloitte and currently serve as an audit committee chairman on 2 public company boards. Randy recently retired from Oracle. We both have a long love story with Newport Beach prior to purchasing our home. Randy grew up in the area and has been body surfing the Wedge since he was a kid. He has gone back every year since and still surfs it to this day at age 64. I started going to Balboa Island 40 years ago. Walking the island boardwalk is my favorite thing to do, and I enjoy talking to fellow homeowners about gardening. We always loved vacationing on Balboa Island and would stay in a VRBO up to 3 weeks at a time, but we wanted to stay a little bit more than that. After all, we tried considering the island as a second home. Sorry, I read that wrong. After all, we already considered the island as a second home. Why not make it official? For 5 years, we tried to get a group of our friends to go in on a second house together, but it didn't come together. Enter Picasso, who made this a reality. We take great pride in our house. We love it. We love frequenting the Irvine Market and the stores on Marine Ave. We have made every effort to get to know our neighbors, even participating with our neighbors along Emerald Ave by joining in stringing the flag banners from our second story to neighbors' windows across the street before Memorial Day for the flag season. We also invited one of our neighbors over to the house and helped resolve a lighting issue that seemed to be bothering them. We are not short-timers. We plan to be in this community for a long time, and we hope the city will continue to welcome us. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners. My name is Russ Dahl. I live at 1707 Plaza del Sur on the Peninsula, Peninsula Point. I live next door to the first Peninsula Point Picasso home. It's been almost a year that I've been participating in city council meetings. I hired an attorney to give us an opinion on our code. I provided that to the city council. And I just want to point out, we have had literally dozens of homeowners come in here, and like these other communities that are in the report, there's nobody who likes this model. It is a timeshare model in many communities, and they've used their code to enforce that. This PowerPoint presentation, I will tell you, since I live next door to this property, this is not the way the property behaves. Whether the people are nice people, they're nice people. Nobody stays more than 3 or 4 days. People come and go. Cleaning crews at all hours of the night. 8 lockers in the garage. You can't afford. There's always multiple families, or many times multiple families in the home. There's plenty of parked cars around the street. So that's the way the property behaves. I think a couple of things that need to be noted in this model. This property is sold and the ownership is in the form of an LLC. This is not a form of ownership issue. This is the way the property is used. I think that's the key distinction. I own my property in a trust, but it's my family, we live there. That's not the issue. We don't know who these neighbors are. There are way more than 8 different families that come through. We don't know if they're guests or what they are. And so that is a disruption to the community. It does change the fabric of the way that these communities are designed to really be inhabited. And I think that's a key point. I think people are recognizing that this changes the fabric of their communities. And that's why if you go out and you research this, there's very little positive comment on these things. It's clearly just sort of, hey, this is changing our communities. The properties are sold at the highest price and they're immediately marked up 20% and sold in fractions. That's the way the model works. When we started this, 2 properties, the one next to me and one in Corona del Mar. Less than a year later, there are 12. Okay, these are proliferating. There was 1 company, there are 3. This is going to continue until we do something about it. And as the gentleman and the lady said, I think we have the regulations. I have legal opinion that says we have the regulations to sort of do this. I hope we do it because it's just not what was intended. I cannot rent my property for less than 30 days. I have neighbors who never occupy it for more than 3 or 4. I just want you to know that. And I appreciate the time and I appreciate you considering this. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Hi, good evening, Commissioners. My name is Lauren. I am also a local Picasso employee and will be reading a statement on behalf of Picasso owner Steve Hayes. My wife Linda and I are both 62 and have 3 adult children and 1 grandchild and another one on the way. For many years, we vacationed at beaches on the East Coast. But after our middle son and his wife were transferred to SoCal for a couple of years for work, we found ourselves being drawn to the California beaches, warm weather, and endless things to do. In particular, we fell in love with the friendly people, the restaurants, the shops at Lido Marina Village, and the convenience of the local Pavilion's grocery store, not to mention some surprisingly good Italian food. We're like you, and we agree that short-term rentals aren't the most well-kept properties and have guests that don't care about how they leave the properties or impact the neighborhood. It's the same reason that we would never buy a rental car. So that's why about 6 months ago, we made a decision to invest as a homeowner in a Picasso property in Newport Beach. And we didn't do it to rent it out and make a profit. We did it for our family. Like you, we want to live in a home that has high standards, is well maintained, and only allows people to stay in the house that have a vested interest in the property owners. Since our purchase, we have gladly paid property, sales, and rental car taxes. We frequent local establishments and stores, enjoy riding our bikes up and down the coast, and have had the opportunity to play both pickleball and golf with some very warm and welcoming local people. That's why we've been surprised by the uproar that the fractional ownership model of 10 or so homes has caused with the community. Unlike the 1,500 already approved short-term rentals, 7 of those are on our street, by the way. We want what's best for the community and are more than willing to pay our share of taxes to make sure that the local infrastructure and schools are not only maintained, but improved on as time goes on. And we won't, nor can't we, rent our home out to strangers. In our case, and since I am still working, we honestly are both looking at the next several years as a trial run to see if we want to have more of a long-term presence in Newport Beach that we can share with our children and grandchildren and you as we grow old. So the next time we're around, I'd be more than happy to introduce our family to you, as long as it's not too late, because we like to go to bed early too.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Good evening, Chair Kleiman and Commissioners. Nancy Scarborough. I wasn't really prepared to speak, so I have some notes. Bear with me. I wanted to point out that there were 2 previous meetings. You guys kind of got off light. At both of those meetings, there were about 75 people in the audience, and most of them were not in favor of this type of homeownership. So you guys are kind of getting a break here, I guess. A couple of points. One, I would like to point out that under this model, a home that say is got a market value of $3 million, and that's just out of the hat, whatever it is, 8 million, whatever. So if a home has a $3 million market value, Picasso can afford to pay more than that because they plan on selling that. So they may sell it for $4 million, or they may buy the house, for $4 million. They divide it up into 8 fractional owners, or less or more, but whatever the number is, they divide it up. So they sell 8 home ownership parcels at $800,000, brings the value of the house to $6,400,000, which is more than the value of the home. So it skews the property values in the neighborhood. So you're creating an asset class that kind of messes with our home values. Second, we've talked about the 8 owners that are the fractional owners. I'm curious, they say that that's not necessarily the case. I would like to know, of the 11 homes that currently operate in Newport Beach, how many of them have 8 owners? I suspect probably all of them. I don't know that, but that would be something that we probably would want to know. By the way, there are 5 active listings for fractional homeowners that are right now on the market. Third, these do operate like STLs. You've heard all the discussion, noise, constant turnover, 2 weeks maximum stay. They're constantly moving in and out of these. These are basically multifamily homes in our single home residence zoning. So that's, to me, that seems like a problem that we need to address. I don't believe that Newport Beach allows Airbnbs, so that's not a comparison. I think that we don't allow that here. And the last thing I'd like to leave you with is, how would you feel living next door to one of these? I think I would not appreciate that, and so I just want to leave you with that thought. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Jeff Kieran. I'm a local Picasso employee, and will be reading a statement on behalf of Picasso owner Anthony Kumar. Honorable Mayor and City Council members, the purpose of this testimony is to introduce the Kumar family and to explain our experience with Picasso thus far. During COVID, we did a tremendous amount of research looking into second ownership. We ultimately decided on the home we have in Newport Beach, California. We have many friends who live in the area and certainly enjoy everything Newport Beach has to offer, from the beaches to the shopping to the restaurants to the Bay Club, etc. The Kumar family has 6 members, 2 daughters, 13 and 6 months, and 2 sons, 12 and 3 years old. I cannot express enough how much this home means to us. The single best part of Picasso is that this constitutes a promised vacation for us. We spend ample weeks each year contributing to the economic growth of the area by enjoying our favorite restaurants, visiting Disneyland, frequenting our favorite local hangouts, and lots of shopping in Newport Beach, California area. Ultimately, it is our goal to later retire in the Newport Beach area. This model is exceptional, whereby we get a taste of the lifestyle, own a piece of the property, and have the opportunity to purchase more shares as the years progress. I also enjoy owning the home with others, as we trust they too will treat the home with the utmost respect. I want nothing but good relations with the city of Newport and with other homeowners. We view this as a great way to own a piece of property while at the same time don't have to worry about covering mortgage costs by virtue of multiple renters or short-term visitors, which would be the case if we were to be the sole owner of a second home. Thank you for your time. I do have a second statement to make. Not only as an employee, I actually own a Picasso in Newport Beach, adjacent, a neighbor to a gentleman who spoke, 2 people prior. I'm afforded the opportunity to purchase it, no different than any of you here in the room. I'm born and raised local in Orange County. My children were born in Newport Beach Hospital, all 3 of my children. It affords my personal family the opportunity to enjoy a second home in the city I grew up going to beaches too. So for me, it's certainly personal, but that's a separate issue from being an employee, and I can understand the viewpoint from both sides. I've yet to meet the neighbor that spoke today. For reasons I don't know, I've seen him in passing. I've seen his family in passing. I've heard stories that he and his family also enjoys Picasso for the experience in other areas and are intrigued by it, and we're looking into homes in those locations. I know lots of owners in our homes in Newport Beach. I know some neighbors. I've spoken to lots of neighbors. I've spoken to neighbors that have great experiences, love our model, live on the same streets of the people who are discussing the issues at hand. I've expressed other conversations with people who know the neighbors that are on the street, and they all say they're harmless, they're uneducated, they're misinformed, and they will help spread the word on what Picasso actually is. I understand everyone has viewpoints, but from my standpoint, being an employee, number one, but also an owner, I think it's a unique stance, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Are there any other speakers this evening?
Good evening, commissioners. I'm reading a statement on behalf of a local business owner. I am a local Picasso employee as well. To the Newport Beach Planning Commission, my name is Jessica Roy, and I'm the chef owner of 608 Dahlia, located in Corona Del Mar. I'm writing this letter to express my support for Picasso and especially the people and families that own them. I first learned of Picasso after learning that they purchased a home down the street from my restaurant and read about their business model. As a business owner in Corona Del Mar, it can be a struggle during the fall and winter months to keep my restaurant at capacity due to the seasonal nature of living and working in a beautiful beach town. Each day before service starts, I take a short walk around the neighborhood to clear my head and prepare for the rush of customers when we open. Since I started working at this restaurant 3 years ago, I noticed one thing that always stood out to me about this neighborhood. In the off-season, many homes sit empty. So when I learned about Picasso and how they offer co-ownership of homes, I was excited at the prospect of homes being utilized year-round by families, as that is what I, as a small business owner, needs customers year-round. When I learned that Newport Beach Planning Commission was having a discussion about Picasso and the larger concept of co-ownership, I needed to speak up. I have had the opportunity to get to know many people in this community, and I can tell you that repeat customers are of the absolute lifeblood of our small businesses in this community, and that is what Picasso owners are. By them being here, they have already spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to be a permanent part of this community. These Picasso owners are not weekend Airbnb partiers. They are part of this community, making trips with their family year-round to stay here and patronize my restaurant and other small businesses in this community. They invest in this community and will continue to do so year after year, which is why I am a strong believer in what Picasso does by making better use of homes so that more families can enjoy what Newport Beach has to offer. Thank you for your consideration. And if I have a little more time, I have one more statement from a Picasso owner from the Stein family. My family owns a Picasso in Newport Beach. As the council explores the topic of, commission explores the topic of co-ownership, I thought it might be helpful to share my story as a co-owner. As longtime Orange County residents, my family have been visiting and enjoying Newport Beach for years and have long dreamed of someday owning our own second home in this beautiful community. Co-owning is something we have done in other cities around the U.S., but it is often a hassle to figure out how to manage the property, and we often list the properties on Airbnb or VRBO during times of non-use. Picasso simplified and modernized this age-old practice of co-owning a home. As busy professionals, Picasso is ideal for our situation. Now we can come to our home in Newport Beach and enjoy doing all the things we love on the island, shop, eat at our usual spots, go to concerts in the park, and pick up groceries at our favorite neighborhood market, as we have always done, except this time we get to end the day in our beautiful home. We hope the Commission and the Council will preserve the ability for us and thousands of other property owners that co-own together in a property-specific LLC, as has been done for generations. Thank you.
Thank you. If we have one more speaker.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Tim. I'm a local Picasso employee and will be reading a statement on behalf of Picasso owner Sam Papoyan. I'm grateful for the opportunity to address the Council today via Picasso employee. My wife and I have 4 kids, a 17-year-old, 2 15-year-olds, and a 1-year-old. We love our Newport Beach home. We have access to the beach and amazing weather. Our neighborhood is quiet and safe. The people are less crazy, unlike Los Angeles. And Newport Beach has some of the best restaurants we frequent often. As owners, we bring more value to the city than short-term renters. The house is managed and monitored. It gives us great comfort knowing our home is being cared for by our co-owners with the same respect. We have made considerable investment in Newport Beach with the purchase of this property and hope we can continue investing and making memories here. If it's okay, I'd like to also add, I am the home manager for Picasso in Newport Beach. Some of the statements tonight regarding 3 to 4 days is false. I have visibility on the calendars, so I see when the owners are coming and going. There are definitely reservations 7 to 14 days at a time. So the statement of 3 to 4 days all the time is not true. I might have a target on my back, but I also want to let you know that I was born at Hoag Hospital. I went to all the local schools, Mariners, Ensign, Newport Harbor. Occupancy with our owners has always been different from Airbnb. I was an employee of Airbnb. I have 20 years of vacation rental business. So our properties are not managed the same way as an Airbnb. There's a vested interest. We enforce the noise enforcement. I also make my number available. I am also available 7 days a week. Since I'm in the properties a lot and also monitoring the trash, which is one of the topics that came up, proactively making sure that the trash is always placed out, even though there's concierge service with the CC&R trash company. To that extent, we proactively work on preventative maintenance for the properties to maintain zero defect. Our owners have a vested interest, a great investment. I speak and I meet with the owners. They're dining at Javier's. They're not going to the local Taco Bell. To that extent, the whole concept of private property sometimes gets lost. In a sense, it's a great investment, but then again, it's not so great on what you can do with it. Fractional ownership with jets. Are we going to minimize how many jets are in the air because there's too many jets in the air? Same with yachts. Are there going to be too many yachts in the harbor? So I take my job seriously. I'm passionate about it. I'm happy to work with any neighbor. I simply have walked across the vicinity and tried to meet as many neighbors as possible. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else like to speak this evening?
Good evening. My name is Ken Rawson, and I've been attending the city council meetings that we've had on this subject for the last month in September. And I guess one of my concerns is, have you seen the second week in September city council meeting? I'm hoping that the city does videos of the city council meetings. Well, if you haven't seen it, I'd ask you to go back and take a look at that meeting. In that meeting, you had an outpouring of the residents of your city that came here in force and filled this room, concerned that the fractional shares is going to take off, just like we're at the cusp of it starting. And oh, there won't be 40 in this city. That'll never happen. Or we don't think it'll ever happen. No. It's going to be just like short-term lodgings, Airbnb, VRBO, and the worry that many residents have of what's happening to our city. With this model that's happening, and it's not just with Picasso, I don't think we should keep saying Picasso, 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 because in some of the information you were sent, there's another company out there called Elite Homes, and they, in their model, they offer a home exchange program where you can exchange your stay and your fractional share to stay at a property within their system anywhere in the world. Now, that sounds to me like a timeshare. That doesn't sound to me that someone who's coming back repeatedly over and over again to a home on Peninsula Point or a home on Balboa Island. So there's a real concern that that's what we're looking at here. And the residents that came to that meeting are asking for the city council's help. In some respects, I guess I don't understand our city government well enough, but I feel it's been kicked down now to the planning committee for you all to try to come up with some kind of wording. And really what we're looking for as the residents is to limit fractional shares, to stop this so it doesn't happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Seeing none, I'll just bring it back to staff. Is there anything you want to respond to?
No, thank you.
Just for clarification, I know Mr. Mosier mentioned the direction from council. I watched the meetings that were referenced. I think some of the other commissioners watched them as well, or maybe were there in person. And I didn't get the same impression that he did about council guidance. So could you sort of summarize the direction that you understand was given for us here tonight?
Certainly. So from the city council meeting, they gave direction to city staff to come back to the planning commission, look at the St. Helena ordinance that they have adopted, and try to find some way to regulate these fractional ownership. It wasn't unanimous support to do this, but it was the majority to provide that direction to staff and to the planning commission to work through this issue and let the planning commission provide guidance and recommendations that you all can support and we can deliver back to the city council.
To prevent or ban or to regulate?
To regulate them.
Thank you. Okay, we'll bring it back up to the commission. Public hearing is closed. Well, I guess we don't have a public hearing. Public comments are closed.
One of the public commenters got me kind of thinking about something. Can we specifically request or restrict a Picasso-like company to only be allowed to purchase and operate existing short-term rental designated properties? So we have 1,500 and something of them in our city. Can we restrict it so that they, meaning these fractional companies, can they only purchase in our city those 1,500 available units?
So we are trying to regulate the land use. And so we regulate the land use by looking at the zone of each of the properties. We're not looking at whether it has a short-term lodging permit or not. So from a regulatory standpoint, the answer is no. We can't focus on just purchasing properties with a permit. We are looking direction from the commission. It's a land use. This is not a permit program. And we're trying to come up with some language of how to provide that regulatory framework to regulate the use of the land. And hence our recommendation of, R1 zone with a 500-foot separation.
And would our city attorney confirm with that?
Yes, I agree with Simone's interpretation on that issue.
And then could we tonight discuss some type of hybrid proposal that kind of combines the two options available so that we could begin the process of working to develop some type of ordinance, but also monitoring the St. Helena case in preparation of that being successful, so that if it is, then we would have a standard to go by from a court ruling that allows us to be prohibitive of fractional, but working in concert by getting ahead of the game to develop some type of some type of ordinance that protects the city in every possible manner that we could develop here. But you know, I want to see what that case comes out in St. Helena, because I don't want to see us being, you know, added to that by doing something today that we get in the potential of a lawsuit. But I would like to, you know, a quarter isn't, or, you know, 6 months isn't very long to wait until to get that answer.
Certainly.
So I would like to adopt some of that, what's going on there, but without having that legal understanding. I don't think I'm prepared to go all the way with option A until I hear an answer from St. Helena.
And I would turn to Chair Kleiman and just ask that the commissioners just develop a consensus of what the direction is from the entire commission.
Are there any other commissioner?
You know, I see this as pretty detailed, and obviously you have people on both sides, and you definitely feel for the residents' complaints as well as it's hearing the stories of the residents. It seems like that's a positive for the city. And I'm looking at all of this. This is a complicated issue. It's one has strong opinions on both sides. So for myself, I'm not prepared to vote for anything tonight or even recommend a direction specifically. My suggestion, and I don't want to make this a motion right now because let everyone speak, but my suggestion is that this commission has been very proactive on a number of things when we've had subcommittees, and we've came together and really studied these issues in detail, and then kind of come back to our planning commission and be able to discuss what we found and be able to vote or recommend those actions that we've come upon or that we came to in those subcommittees to the city council. So my recommendation is that we form some sort of subcommittee. I mean, I'm willing to help out there and volunteer to be able to get at least, I'll say, my head around this more and be able to see everyone's concerns in this and to hear everyone's comments and positions here, so we can come up with a policy that obviously is very important to a lot of people. But I can't do this. I can't recommend something halfway not even halfway, but until I know more detail and can be able to get all the participants' ideas.
Let's just continue down the line. Commissioner Harris, do you have anything you want to add?
Can you clarify too, there were two things that were going back to council, our recommendation, and then they were also, we could vote on potentially a moratorium. Is that what they were going to have to vote on?
So the council elected to not move forward with the moratorium.
Okay. Yeah, you know, neither of these options totally satisfies things for me. I feel like option A, we get sued or, you know, leave ourselves open for it really quickly. I feel like option B, I'm okay with, you know, some, you know, not all of it. And I don't know if it directly handles all the impacts people are talking about. There's clearly impacts that are affecting people. And I'd like to really get my arms around exactly what those are and be precise on how we can handle those now. I don't know if option B gets there. But, you know, A just seems too far. And I think we get sued quickly. Or so if we could, I'm not opposed to a working group or being involved in that, or getting some people from the public or neighbors involved as well, and obviously in the industry, as we talked about and Commissioner Wyden talked about earlier. I'd be open to that, and it also buys us some time to let St. Helen work its way through, so we at least have some standing when, you know, we're ready to make, or, you know, when we can make a final decision.
Commissioner Klostermeyer?
I agree with your comments. I don't think that either one of these options totally satisfies what we're looking to do here. I think there's obviously some concern with option A over future litigation. to me, this does feel like a short-term rental. It may be a higher-end short-term rental, and we were able to cap the number of short-term rentals that we have in the community in the past. So I think we need to rework what option B is here and find a way to regulate this with separation standards that will satisfy the public. I can tell you, I would not be thrilled to have a short-term rental or a fractional ownership next door to me and have people constantly coming and going. So I fully hear the concerns of the community. But I think we need to find a way to proactively work with these agencies and see if there is an agreeable way to regulate this.
Secretary Rosine?
I'm not a lawyer, so the whole concept of option A sounds like that puts us in some sort of jeopardy. So, you know, while that seems like it makes a whole lot of sense to me right off the top, I guess there's some issues associated with that, and certainly we don't want to expose the city to future litigation. You know, it seems like all of these units appear to be in the R2 zones. I can't speak to whether or not an R2 zone is appropriate versus an R1, but I can tell you that it feels completely inappropriate in an R1 zone. You know, R2 zones. So, you know, I guess we're getting into zoning, which starts to go to what does this ordinance look like? And I feel like we need to see what that is. Jaime, I appreciate everything that you've provided here. You know, you start to come up with this concept of building upon it. Could the next step be providing some sort of written ordinance that we could start to identify and get specific? We're talking about very large platitude-like discussion here. I want to get into something that has a little more meat to it so that I understand what exactly is being proposed. So that's my comment.
If I could just jump in for a moment, I think at the planning commission stage, I think you should come up with what you think is the best thing and make a recommendation to the city council. You shouldn't be so concerned about the litigation. You know, if there are issues of litigation, that's an issue that we will advise the city council about when it gets there. So I don't want you to be overly afraid that moving forward or making the recommendation that you think is best is somehow impaired by the litigation up in St. Helena. I mean, that case is likely to go up on appeal after it's decided. It's gonna be a long time for that to get worked out. So I do think that that's more of a council issue, and you should move forward with what you think is best.
I mean, if I could just add something to that, this feels like a policy decision, and we're not policymakers. So I guess that's why I think there may be some hesitancy to create policy when I don't think that that's particularly our scope, or at least that's my understanding. So that's I think where we're struggling here. But if there was something that was directly and very specific from the council that said this is what we want, it's easy to put that together in the terms of an ordinance. And so that's my comment.
So I'll respond to that and just say the policy decision was already made at council, and that was why I was clarifying the direction that was provided by council to staff and to planning commission. So this is a study session. This is the first time that we are seeing this at the planning commission level, and we don't need to craft language from the dais and approve something tonight. We do just need to provide further direction to staff, and it sounds like, if I'm reading everyone correctly, that there's maybe some consensus to start to look at language in crafting an ordinance. Well, first of all, in defining what fractional ownership is, that's first and foremost, and then secondarily, what the ordinance would look like to regulate similarly potentially to the way short-term rentals or short-term lodging has been, to address some of the concerns that we've heard, prohibiting rentals, the good neighbor policy, things that are of concern generally throughout the city, like parking and trash collection, and overall just how to address the transient nature, it sounds like, is the biggest concern. So I don't know if there's general support from the commission to give staff the direction to take the next step on addressing those two things. Number one, defining what fractional ownership is, what type of properties and what type of uses fall under fractional ownership, and then secondarily, as I just said, the types of things that we would like to see addressed and potential ways to enforce the behaviors that we would like to mitigate.
Commissioner Clement, was there also an interest to form an ad hoc committee to work with staff on this, or?
I only heard that from one commissioner. I don't know. Were you talking about just the commission or working with?
How we did the ADU and the ordinances that we did. I don't know. I was on both of those, and Lauren, I think you were on both as well. And I just thought they were proactive. I mean, Jaime helped out so much with his knowledge and Jim and Simone being there. There's just a lot here to digest, and I echo but I definitely echo what Commissioner or Secretary Rosine says. It's to me, it's getting into the policy, which I've said over and over again on this dais that we're not a policy-making body, we're balls and strikes, but that's why I would rather get in and dive in this a little bit and really specifically address what I think is our purview, which is the land use section of this, and kind of go from there. But
I'm certainly supportive of an ad hoc committee. I would think it should include more than just representatives from Planning Commission. If we went that direction, I think it needs to include potentially, so we get feedback from members of the public and also some of these operators, get some dialogue going if that's the direction that the commission would like to go. Commissioner Weigand, did you have something you wanted to add?
If Commissioner Rosine brought up a good point about, Planning Commission versus City Council, should that ad hoc just be a City Council ad hoc versus a Planning Commission or combo ad hoc? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, the council did delegate this to the Planning Commission because they are looking at it from a land use perspective, and so land use is really generally starts with the Planning Commission. You have the staff to support you. From an ad hoc committee, it is primarily the planning commissioners. For the 3-member ad hoc committee, if you want other members, then now you have a Brown Act issue, and so you have to do all the public noticing and the agendizing. So it's just kind of food for thought on this.
I wanted to that wasn't why I initially raised my hand, but then we got into that. But as far as the number 2 review process options, in Costa Mesa, when they started dealing with their new ordinance on recovery residences, they had explicitly said that the Planning Commission has the authority to review those. So, what staff think as far as time commitments? I mean, is the Planning Commission the appropriate body for? Obviously, that's maybe a discussion for us to have, and that's why it's part of this proposal to discuss. I don't know if we want to go through each one of these. What was it, 10 or 11 proposals or 12? I forget the number that's on here, but part of these, it said you have a minor use permit, zoning administrator, Planning Commission, and or the other option is having no hearings whatsoever. So Simone, I guess your staff would get to grant any purchase of the fractional ownership, just on your own without us coming here. I guess we could appeal it. Is that how that would go? Or
well, and that is the discussion that we want to have with the commissioners. And I do think that, from a staff standpoint, we work better when we have a steering committee, an ad hoc committee, Planning Commission. So I think we could be able to develop a language. But that was just one recommendation, which was just a zone clearance, which was a staff member would review it, make sure it complies with all the zoning regulations, the distance separation if we did to adopt that, and issue an actual letter. And that's what that was.
And not having this presentation prior to the meeting here, I think it's poor public policy to, from this dais here, make decisions base on there, but we should start making that in our mind as far as what we think these processes should be when an application comes through for these. Should we, every time somebody buys one of these fractional ownership properties, us making that decision whether to green light it or disapprove it? So that's something we'll have to, come back and discuss. And then as far as the separation standards, what was the determination for 500 feet? Why couldn't it be 1,000 feet? Or any other type of feet? What's the?
We actually, yeah, thank you, Commissioner Wigan. We actually did map what the existing fractionals that we do know and put the 500 foot and put 1,000 feet. And so we mapped it. We just came up with the 500. We thought that was a little bit more appropriate to find that right balance. But, that's something we definitely would like to get some more guidance from the commission.
Yeah, because there was a discussion in grandfathering. If you're grandfathered in, that shouldn't be an issue. But moving forward,
right,
1,000 foot. That's kind of what I'm looking for in the other ordinance we were talking about a while back on sober living homes or residential recovery homes. So, I don't know if that is in the same category, but these are all things we're going to have to think about when we come back to discuss this, because obviously we're just giving staff guidance tonight. We're just trying to say what we think, but if we're not even giving staff guidance, then we're going to have to come back again or form this ad hoc or do something to then have a little more meat to it. But since we are seeing this for the first time, I don't think it's fair for us to make those decisions tonight, but we should discuss that. Thanks.
Simone, when we did the ADU ad hoc committee, we did bring in members of the public. We had some realtors that joined us once or twice and kind of weighed in on the types of, or actually, excuse me, they were architects that weighed in on the types of projects that they were seeing and things they thought would be helpful or potentially problematic.
That's true, Chair Kleiman. So that's different to meet with industry, meet with the public and have that discussion. It's different when you say a member of the public is part of the committee or a member of industry is part of the committee. And that ad hoc committee is not just 3 commissioners, but 3 commissioners and 2 residents. Now that's a Brown Act issue.
Thank you for that clarification. Commissioner Lowry?
How about this? It doesn't look like we have consensus on any specific policy recommendation here, so I'm going to go with a motion here to form an ad hoc committee specifically to review fractional ownership with 3 members from the Planning Commission, and maybe make it a goal to report back to the Planning Commission within 90 days of our findings. And I'll go if Jim or Simone does not think that's doable, then I'm definitely open to that. But at least I think get us that direction and to really be able to dig in this more and bring not only the people who are on the committee, but then be able to bring, I think, a lot more detail back to the Planning Commission and be able to discuss this. And like I said, I'll volunteer to be one of those 3 if the Planning Commission as a whole so chooses.
Before we wait for a second, I know there's some urgency from council on this, and I'm not sure how much time you think that process. I know we took our time with ADUs. We wanted to make sure that we fully vetted everything. We had a little more leeway with our timing there, but is 90 days something that would even be?
Well, from a staff standpoint, I like the 90 days because there's a lot going on towards the end of the year. To do it, I think we just endeavor to do it quicker, to satisfy council, but I think that's the goal, is to do it as rapidly as possible, maximum 90 days. If there's a motion, a support, and there's consensus with this commission, then we would have to bring back that ad hoc committee resolution to agendize it properly and put it on the next planning commission agenda. So we would come back to the next meeting, put it on the agenda, and you would vote on it.
Okay. Do we have a second for Commissioner
Are we
Lowry?
just like a study session, though? Are we just making recommendations here? We're not really voting on anything.
Yeah, so you wouldn't, I'm probably being way too technical, so we don't really need a motion or anything. You just give us kind of general direction, and we'll bring it back at the next meeting. If everyone's kind of supportive of that, maybe just raise your hands, and then we'll bring it back at the next meeting for an action.
I just for comment, is this realistic, Simone? I mean, can we do this faster? Can we do this slower? We need to hear what staff's got too. I mean, you got a pretty heavy plate on your current
I
life
think-
of being on community development.
Both Jim and I turned to Jaime and asked him if 90 days was appropriate, and Jaime said yes, he can do 90 days.
Is there a quicker than 90 days?
It's up to the commission's availability. If you're all available, the 3 members are available, and then we can do it in the 60 days.
And you guys would feel comfortable of 60 days too, or?
Yes, we can. Yes, Jaime, right? Yes.
How about 45?
I like 90 better, but if you can say.
Looked like we had a majority. Show of hands.
Yeah.
Is everyone comfortable with that? Do we have any? Well, it sounds like as quickly as we can possibly reasonably accommodate. No more than 90 days. Yeah. Commissioner Weigand?
I'm acceptable to 60 to 90 days.
Do you also think we should have volunteers for that ad hoc committee at this time, or you can bring that back for?
We can just have that item open, and then the chair can appoint at the next meeting, or unless you want to go ahead and take names today.
Rather than me appointing any eager volunteers? All right, there you go. Commissioner Lowry, Commissioner Harris, and Secretary Rosine.
But that would need to be voted on, correct? Yeah.
Right.
Staff, is there anything else we need to do on this item before moving on?
No, thank you.
Okay. Item number 3, motions for consideration. Hearing none, we'll move on to item number 4, report by the Community Development Director.
Thank you. It's Jim Campbell, your Deputy Community Development Director. What I do want to report to the Commission is that we did receive a letter yesterday from the State Department of Housing and Community Development. Our housing element is certified, so we are the 9th jurisdiction in Orange County.
Congratulations.
To achieve that. Thank you very much. Thank you for all your work on it as well. The other item that I had was really the next meeting. We do have a couple of items. We have 4 items on the agenda next week, including the creation of a subcommittee. We'll obviously add another item to that agenda, the creation of the ad hoc for this issue tonight. But so we do have a full meeting agenda on October the 20th.
So there's 2 subcommittees.
Oh, the other subcommittee is really something the council has directed. I'll just fill you in on that one. The council has directed the various committees and commissions to establish an ad hoc committee to look at your codes, look at all of our codes to see if there's ways to reduce those or maybe sunset some of those provisions. And so this is a separate initiative the council is asking that the commission do. So we'll be bringing that forward for a full report at the next meeting.
Great.
And that's my report.
Anyone from the audience want to comment on the director's report? Hearing none, we'll move on to requests for excused absences. Hearing none, we are adjourned.